Toltec and Aztec empires, 1000 to 1521. The Aztec, who seized control of the Valley of Mexico in the early 15th century, modeled themselves after the Toltec, who controlled the same area several centuries earlier. By one Aztec account, the deeds of the Toltec were all good, all perfect, all marvelous. In truth, the Toltec had much the same strengths and weaknesses as the Aztec. Both were energetic city builders and empire builders who ruthlessly exploited the people they conquered and were overthrown after dominating the region for a century or two. The Toltec arose to power in the 10th century and built an impressive capital at Tula, just north of the Valley of Mexico. By 1000, Tula had a population of at least 30,000. It was laid out on a grid and contained pyramids, temples, and ball courts, much like those found in earlier Mesoamerican cities. Towering stone images of warriors and sculpted scenes of conquest and human sacrifice adorned the city, indicating that the Toltec were merciless to their enemies. An altar near one of the ball courts was found covered with shattered human skulls. Toltec warriors belonged to military orders associated with predatory animals such as the jaguar and the eagle. Their rulers took the names of gods such as Mixcoatl, cloud serpent, and Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent. According to legend, the ruler named Quetzalcoatl, later revered by the Aztec as a god king, was ousted by a rival and fled eastward with his followers, eventually reaching the Yucatan Peninsula. The Maya told a similar tale about a conqueror named Feathered Serpent, who invaded their homeland shortly before 1000. There could be something to these stories, for the Yucatan city of Chichen Itza, which endured long after other Maya urban centers collapsed, closely resembled Tula and may have come under Toltec influence or control. The Toltec grew rich through conquest. Quetzalcoatl, while he reigned at Tula, reportedly had separate houses where he stored gold and silver, turquoise, coral, shells, exotic feathers, and other treasures. Some of the precious objects the Toltec amassed and crafted into works of art were acquired through trade, but the rest were extracted from conquered people who preferred giving tribute in the form of goods or crops to offering their lives. At its height in the 11th century, the Toltec domain covered much of central Mexico, but an empire dependent on tribute could not survive long when its subjects had little left to give. A drought in the 12th century weakened the Toltec, and around 1170, Tula was sacked and burned. The downfall of the Toltec occurred amid tumultuous migrations of people from arid outlying areas into the Valley of Mexico, whose lakes and marshes made it an oasis in times of drought. Among those intruders were the Aztec, also known as the Mexica, a name they bequeathed to the Mexican people. They arrived in the valley from the north in the 13th century and settled on a marshy island at the western edge of Lake Texcoco, near what is now Mexico City. By their own account, they were living in a meager existence when they reached their new home, hunting with bows and arrows and fishing with nets. But they knew how to plant corn, beans, and other crops, and recognized the fertile potential of the lake and its marshlands. Others were drawn to the same area. Aztecs faced competition for its resources. According to legend, their fabled leader, Huitzilopochtli, I don't know how to pronounce it, later deified by the Aztec, assured them that they had nothing to fear from their rivals and were destined for greatness. "We shall proceed to establish ourselves and settle down," he proclaimed posthumously through priestly seers, "and we shall conquer the peoples of the universe." The Aztec set out on the path to conquest in the 14th century by serving as warriors for powerful neighbors who eventually recognized them as equals. In 1428, they turned on those allies and overthrew them in a campaign led by Itzcoatl, founder of the Aztec Empire. With ruthless determination, Itzcoatl and his successors expanded their domain by force of arms until it reached across the continent from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. Theirs was the greatest empire yet seen in the Americas, covering 80,000 square miles and embracing as many as 6 million people. Fueling this phenomenal expansion was the Aztec belief that conquest was a sacred duty, a means by which obtaining thousands of sacrificial victims for gods who required blood offerings if their blessings were to be sustained. Others in the Americas shared such beliefs, but the Aztec practiced human sacrifice on a phenomenal scale, as if the very magnitude of their success called for bloodlettings beyond compare. There was much more to Aztec culture than blood and gore, however. Unlike the Toltec, they exacted tribute from people they conquered in the form of gold, silver, jade, and coveted ceremonial objects such as bird feathers. Those articles and other items acquired through trade with lands beyond the bounds of the empire made the Aztec as rich as they were powerful. Rulers, merchants, priests, and other privileged positions lived in high style and oversaw a well-disciplined society. The wealth and complexity of the Aztec Empire dazzled Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez and his followers who arrived in 1519 and were welcomed by King Moctezuma II before their hostile intentions became clear. Spanish accounts added greatly to our knowledge of this remarkable Native American civilization, which would not long survive its first contact with Europeans. At the heart of the Aztec Empire lay the capital of Tenochtitlan, arising miraculously from the marshes of Lake Texcoco. Before building a city there, Aztecs first had to reclaim land by digging drainage canals and piling up earth to form terraces firm enough to support buildings. This was the same technique used to create raised fields called chinampas that provided people living around the lake with fertile farmland. Founded in 1325, Tenochtitlan grew quickly, emerging within a century or so as a magnificent city of nearly 200,000 inhabitants. It was laced with canals and linked by causeways to the mainland. The Aztec Empire covered much of central and southern Mexico when Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez arrived at the capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519. The city was divided into 4 quadrants, with the ceremonial plaza at its hub dominated by the Great Pyramid, which had twin temples at the summit dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc. The Spaniards who first saw that structure and other monuments looming above the lake could hardly believe their eyes. The buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision, wrote Bernal Diaz del Castillo. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked if it was not all a dream. By that time, Tenochtitlan had expanded to include the neighboring city of Tlatlco, built on another marshy island nearby. The land between the 2 islands had been filled in, but Tlatlco remained a separate district within the capital, home to a great marketplace brimming with goods from throughout Mesoamerica, including precious metals and stones, embroidered cotton fabric, sandals, pottery, bark paper, dyes and inks, firewood soaked in pitch, axes of copper and tin, gourds for dipping cocoa, salt, spices, baked goods, fruit, fish, fowl, and animal pelts of every description. Here, as in the Old World, merchants offered slaves for sale, men and women captured in battles or raids and driven to the market in shackles. Goose quills filled with gold served traders as a medium of exchange. City officials inspected the merchandise to ensure that no one was cheated, and disputes were settled by magistrates in a nearby courthouse. As many as 60,000 people swarmed through the plaza and its surrounding arcades, with few public disturbances of the sort that mar similar gatherings in Europe. When we arrived at the great marketplace, wrote Bernal Diaz, we were astounded at the number of people and the quantity of merchandise that it contained, and at the good order and control that it was maintained, for we had never seen such a thing before. The wealthiest and most prestigious Aztec merchants were those who engaged in long-distance trade. Some ranged far to the south in search of macaw feathers, jaguar pelts, and other prized items from the tropics. Aztec merchants sometimes entered hostile territory in disguise and served as spies, collecting intelligence that might be used against the people with whom they traded. Merchants paid part of their earnings in taxes to Aztec rulers, and some served as royal advisors and administrators. Aztec kings lived in lavish surroundings that rivaled the courts of European monarchs. The palace complex in Tenochtitlan consisted of 300 rooms, including many storehouses, workshops for royal assistants and artisans, libraries, offices for accountants, and an aviary and zoo, whose denizens included eagles, jaguars, birds, and rattlesnakes. The well-tended palace grounds contained baths, fountains, fruit trees, and gardens. It was a wonder to see, and to take care of it there were many gardeners, wrote Bernal Diaz. Everything was made in masonry and well cemented, baths and walks and closets, and apartments like summer houses where they danced and sang. When Aztec dignitaries appeared before King Moctezuma II, who came to power in his 30s in 1502, and was 53 years old when the Spaniards encountered him, they went barefoot, wore humble clothing, and kept their eyes downcast, addressing him as Lord, my great Lord. He dined behind a screen so that no one would see him eat, attended by serving ladies, advisors, and dwarfs who acted as jesters. He had 2 wives and many mistresses. When he went out in public, attendants swept the ground before him and covered him with a canopy of green feathers. When an Aztec king died, his successor was selected from among his surviving male relatives by the nation's supreme military council. Typically, the successor was already serving as head of that council, and his election was a mere formality. But he then had to prove his fitness to serve by demonstrating his might in battle. Soon after his coronation, a stirring ceremony in which he was carried in a litter to the summit of the Great Pyramid in Tenochtitlan and offered some of his own blood to the sun god by cutting his ear and legs with a jaguar's claw. The new king embarked on a coronation war. Victory would bring him captives who would then be sacrificed atop the Great Pyramid during his confirmation ceremony. Most Aztec rulers were victorious in battle because they commanded the services of large and well-motivated armies. Each ward or neighborhood in the capital had to contribute 400 men to military service if called upon. The city contained nearly 80 wards, meaning that it could furnish roughly 30,000 men to the army. Although wards were required to provide troops, taxes, and labor to the king, they had their own governing councils, schools, and temples, and owned land communally. In effect, the fighting men recruited from such neighborhoods were citizen soldiers with a strong interest in protecting the communities and perpetuating the empire. Despite the dedicated troops at their disposal, Aztec rulers sometimes suffered defeats or disappointments in battle. One such setback occurred to King Tizoc, who came to power in 1481 and embarked on a coronation war against enemies in mountainous countries where the terrain made it difficult for him to take advantage of his numerical superiority. Tizoc barely avoided defeat and returned to the capital with only 40 captives, a meager haul when compared with the thousands of prisoners seized and sacrificed by other Aztec kings. It was an unpromising debut, and Tizoc later faced rebellions from subjects who doubted his resolve and no longer wished to pay him tribute. In 1486, after 5 dismal years in office, he was poisoned, perhaps by his brother, who inaugurated his own triumphant reign with a bloodbath of unprecedented proportions. After a highly successful coronation war, Ahuizotl herded some 20,000 captives back to Tenochtitlan and sacrificed them atop the Great Pyramid, which he had rebuilt for his gruesome confirmation ceremony. Guards conducted a seemingly endless stream of bound victims to the summit, where priests wielding razor-sharp knives cut open their chests and ripped out their hearts, which they offered to the gods along with the victims' blood. Afterward, the lifeless bodies were rolled down the steps and beheaded. Their skulls were displayed on a giant rack, offering grim testimony to the bloodlust that consumed Aztec rulers and the gods they worshipped. Priests willingly took part in the slaughter because they believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to make the earth fruitful and might lose their power to do good if they were not constantly sustained by blood offerings. Some victims were honored and even worshipped before death because they were reenacting sacrifices made by the gods for the good of the people. A young man without any faults or blemishes was chosen to play the part of the Aztec war god, for example, and lived for a year as an exalted figure. Shortly before he died, he wed 4 priestesses who lived with him as goddesses. When his time came, he went to the sacrificial altar voluntarily and died in glory. Other Aztec rites were less inspiring for the victims. Priests devoted to Toltec, the god of springtime and renewal, sacrificed captives in the spring and flayed them. Priests wore the victims' skins for 20 days. Bernal Diaz del Castillo reported, and smelled like dead dogs. Aztec priests performed many useful functions when they were not conducting sacrifices. Like the monks of medieval Europe, they were well educated and served as scribes, artists, and guardians of knowledge. Like Maya priests, they watched the heavens for important astronomical events and kept track of a complex calendar consisting of 2 cycles, a 260-day ceremonial year, and a 365-day solar year, which coincided once every 52 years. For the Aztec, the end of that 52-year cycle was a time fraught with danger. On the last night of the cycle, to ward off evil and regenerate the world, all fires were extinguished in the capital, and priests at the summit of an extinct volcano near the city kindled a new fire on the chest of a sacrificial victim. Torches were then dipped in that fire and carried to Tenochtitlan to illuminate the city and consecrate the new year. Such rituals helped unite Aztec society, which offered many benefits to its members, including the opportunity for honored warriors of common origins to join the ranks of the elite. But Aztec rulers made little effort to share those benefits with outsiders by integrating conquered people into their society, as the Romans did by granting citizenship to foreign subjects. Aztecs recognized some neighboring groups as allies, but they remained sharply at odds with tribes they subjugated and milked them for tribute and sacrificial victims. This aroused fear and resentment and provided ready recruits for any challenger bold enough to defy the oppressors. As it turned out, the assault that shattered the Aztec or the Mexico world in 1521 was led by none other than Hernan Cortez and his fellow Spaniards, assisted by rebellious tribes. But the empire might soon have fallen even without European interference, as had happened before in Mesoamerica to the Toltec and to other conquerors. In their relentless pursuit of blood and treasure, the Aztec virtually ensured the destruction of their regime by native foes or rivals from abroad. And we think about the Aztecs, we think about how they sacrificed humans and gave the heart of a sacrificial victim to Cortez because they thought Cortez was a god, and they thought that appeasing him, they thought it was an honorable thing. However, the Cortez and the people that were with him thought that it was absolutely disgusting. And here we see differences in cultures meeting at a very interesting point in time in the early 16th century. Waging war was a serious business for Aztec rulers who amassed armies of as many as 200,000 men for campaigns of conquest, but it was also a ceremony with stirring rituals and regalia. Like the Toltec, the Aztec had warrior societies devoted to the jaguar and eagle, each of which had a distinctive costume. Eagle warriors wore an eagle headdress and a cloak and leggings representing the bird wings and talons. Members of the society gathered in a lodge known as the Eagle House, where youngsters listened to war stories related by their elders and learned how to handle weapons. Simply gaining admission to one of these societies was a privilege, but greater honor awaited those who performed feats in battle. Warriors who captured enemies, which was considered far better than killing them, since captives could be sacrificed to the gods, wore special outfits depending on the number of prisoners they claimed. The leading Aztec warriors were often from high-ranking families, but commoners could distinguish themselves as well by capturing 4 enemies, which entitled them to membership in one of the warrior societies. Commoners could also learn the right to dine at the palace and wear cotton clothing and sandals, status symbols that distinguished them from ordinary Aztec, who went barefoot and wore rough clothing woven of maguey fiber. Military service thus served as an avenue to advancement in Aztec society. When an army was ready to march, heralds blew conch shells. Scouts led, followed by warrior priests, bearing images of gods and honored warriors of the military societies. Then came masses of regular fighting men from Tenochtitlan, followed by recruits from allied city-states. Bringing up the rear were soldiers supplied as tribute by subject peoples. Each successful war of conquest enlarged tribute to Tenochtitlan in the form of troops, laborers, or goods. But not all campaigns were aimed at conquering territory. Some were so-called flower wars, whose sole purpose was to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Like the Maya, the Aztec played a premium on capturing enemies of high rank, who were considered well-suited for a flowery death, one in which choice victims were put to death with great ceremony to honor the gods. Peru's Chimu and Inca empires, 1000 to 1536. Like the Aztec in Mesoamerica, the Inca created a vast empire in South America in the 15th century by building on the foundations of older civilizations. The Inca of the Peruvian highlands drew lessons from the Chimu, who had long dominated the coast. The Chimu began their ascent to power around the year 1000 in the Moqué River Valley, where the once formidable Moqué Kingdom had collapsed in the 7th century. Irrigation had long been practiced here, but the Chimu expanded on the engineering feats of their predecessors and built reservoirs. One canal snaked through 50 miles of dunes to feed water to the capital of Chanchan, which had nearly 30,000 inhabitants. Around 1300s, Chimu rulers embarked on conquests that brought more than 600 miles of the Peruvian coast under their control by 1470. It soon fell to the Inca, who organized their vast expanding empire along Chimu lines and incorporated their roads and waterworks. The Inca began their imperial quest around 1400 when they outgrew the confines of their native Cusco Valley, high in the Andes. The soil there was fertile, and terraced hillsides helped preserve moisture, but rainfall was scant and yields were insufficient for a growing population. The yearning for more and better land may well have set Inca rulers on a path to conquest, but expansion soon became an end in itself, a way for each successive king to prove his worth. The ruler who did most to forge this empire came to power in 1438 and took the name Pachacuti, or He Who Transforms the Earth, a fitting title for a king who enlarged the Inca world through conquest and changed the way it was governed. All the wealth a king acquired during his reign, Pachacuti decreed would be devoted to housing and caring for his mummified remains. This practice reinforced the idea that the ruler was immortal. It also forced each new ruler to make his own fortune through conquest. Inca kings could recruit large armies because all people had to serve the state periodically as soldiers, laborers, or farmers, a third of whose harvest went to support the king and his works. The same obligations applied to all conquered subjects. Pachacuti imposed further on some defeated groups by resettling them near the Inca homeland where they were closely watched. Loyal subjects were sent to colonize newly conquered territory. Such measures helped transform the sprawling Inca domain, which extended for some 2,500 miles from present-day Ecuador southward to Chile and embraced nearly 100 ethnic groups into a tightly regimented state. Binding the empire together was a remarkable highway system connecting and consisting of two main arteries, one along the coast and another along the Andes. Way stations were located a day's journey apart, and footbridges carried pedestrians and pack llamas across rivers. The Inca had no writing system, but kept meticulous records by tying knots on strings. Inspectors visited homes regularly to see that all who were eligible for labor or armed service were meeting their obligations and ensure that housing conditions were sanitary. The Inca capital of Cusco had sewers and buildings there, and in the nearby ceremonial center of Machu Picchu were neatly constructed of snugly fitted stones. On rare occasions, such as the inauguration of kings, the Inca sacrificed as many as 200 young people to their gods. More often, they sacrificed llamas or made offerings of food. Every day, Inca priests offered cornmeal to honor the sun god. "Eat this, Lord Sun," they proclaimed, "so that you will know that we are your children." The Inca pantheon included several female deities, including Earth Mother and Moon Mother, wife of the sun god. Devotees known as chosen women lived in seclusion at shrines and temples and wove richly embroidered fabrics. Like the Aztec Empire, the realm of the Inca was already under stress when Spanish conquistadors arrived. Resentments among subject ethnic groups, diseases of European origin, and a power struggle in Cusco made it possible for the small Spanish force led by Francisco Pizarro that reached Peru in 1532 to divide and conquer the vast Inca Empire. Mississippians and Anasazi, 1000 to 1540. Before the arrival of Spanish colonists, no great empires arose in North America to rival those in Mesoamerica or South America. By 1000, however, complex societies with strong leaders were building impressive monuments in the Mississippi Valley and the desert southwest. Here, as elsewhere in the New World, Native Americans were constructing an elaborate cultural framework that was torn asunder when Europeans arrived in the 1500s. The emergence of complex societies in North America resulted from advances in food production that enabled people to settle in sizable villages. In most places, the growing season was too short to allow people to derive much benefit from the corn originally introduced from the southwest, which required up to 200 frost-free days to ripen. Native Americans were constantly developing crop varieties better suited to their environment, however, and by the 8th century, tribes in the eastern woodlands were planting corn that matured within 120 days. By cultivating corn in combination with beans and squash, they obtained a nearly complete diet and had to spend much less time hunting and gathering. In fertile areas like the Mississippi Valley, the impact of the development was profound. Tribes that once spent much of the year scrounging around for subsistence settled in sizable permanent communities and harvested surpluses that supported artisans, priests, and rulers. Even common people in this Mississippian culture, which soon spread beyond the Mississippi River and its tributaries to other fertile river valleys in the southeast, could now devote considerable energy to non-subsistence activities such as trade, ceremonies, and public works. A similar transformation had occurred earlier among the Adena and Hopewell mound builders of the Ohio Valley, but Mississippians, with their greater reliance on corn and other crops, achieved a higher level of social complexity and constructed even bigger monuments. Every morning the great chief honors by his presence the rising of his elder brother and salutes him with many howlings as soon as he appears above the horizon. Afterward, raising his hand above his head and turning from the east to the west, he shows him the direction which he must take in his course. The most important center of Mississippian culture was Cahokia, near the east bank of the Mississippi, not far from modern-day St. Louis. By 1000, Cahokia had at least 10,000 inhabitants. The population may have peaked at 20,000 or more. Many residents lived in clusters of pole and thatch dwellings outside Cahokia's vast plaza, which was surrounded by a stockade. Within the enclosure lay houses for the elite and massive burial mounds, one of which covered some 16 acres and rose 100 feet. The earthen mounds were constructed in stages over several generations and contained the remains of leaders and their followers, some of whom were sacrifices. One ruler interacted at Cahokia, received a regal grave offering of 20,000 shell beads, and was buried with at least 60 other people. Some were probably relatives and others were evidently captives, for their heads and hands had been cut off. Mississippian rulers were considered worthy of such sacrifices because they were linked with the gods. Priests tended sacred flames in temples atop the burial mounds, and the rulers themselves likely served as priests of a cult devoted to the sun god, with whom they identified. Here, as in ancient Egypt, massive tombs that towered over the surrounding countryside symbolized the longing of rulers to become one with the gods. Mississippian rulers derived their wealth and prestige in part from tribute received from surrounding villages, most of which had their local own small burial mounds. Local chiefs in those outlying villages recognized the ruler as their overlord, to whom they owed duties in the form of crops, labor, or military service. Rulers could expand their domain by sending out warriors armed with bows and clubs to conquer neighboring groups, but it was difficult for them to force villagers hundreds of miles away to pay regular tribute. Most Mississippian rulers controlled fairly small domains and obtained what they needed from the more distant areas through trade. Precious materials such as seashells from the Gulf Coast, used to craft ceremonial objects, were transported by river and trail to markets up to 1,000 miles distant. By 1200, Mississippian culture covered a large portion of the Midwest and Southeast. Sites like Etowah in Georgia and Moundville in Alabama, which contained 20 mounds within its walled plaza, were less populous than Cahokia, but the inhabitants went to no less effort and expense to glorify deceased rulers. By 1300, this extravagant culture was in decline, perhaps because a change in climate, reduced harvest, or high population densities near ceremonial centers exhausted local resources and posed health risks. The swampy, humid environment of the Mississippi Basin and other river valleys of the southeast may have contributed to the spread of disease. For whatever reason, Cahokia and other Mississippian sites were abandoned by 1400, and their customs and beliefs were passed down to tribes such as the Natchez, who lived in smaller villages and built less imposing mounds. The constructive feats of the Mississippians were rivaled by the people referred to by the Navajo in later times as the Anasazi, or ancient ones. Master builders, they erected multi-story apartments and cliff dwellings in what is now Four Corners region of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, structures that were perfectly suited to the desert environment and stand among the finest examples of Native American architecture. Two related cultures known as the Mogollon and the Hohokam left enduring monuments in southern New Mexico and in Arizona. These southwestern societies shared a way of life based on the cultivation of corn, the crafting of clay pots used to store crops and hold water, and the construction of houses made of adobe or stones joined with adobe. The Mogollon people living in New Mexico's Mimbres Valley in the 11th century fashioned clay vessels inscribed with exquisite animal motifs and geometrical designs that inspired southwestern potters even after. The Mimbres also diverted water from hillside streams to nourish their crops, but the greatest irrigation works in the region were produced by the Hohokam, living along the Gila and Salt rivers in Arizona. They dug a network of canals extending for several hundred miles. Fields irrigated by this system supported communities up to 1,000 inhabitants, whose customs resembled those of Mesoamericans in some ways. Many Hohokam villages had courts for ball games, for example, although there is no evidence that they sacrificed the losers as the Maya did. Hohokam culture reached its peak between 800 and 1100, when villagers constructed imposing multi-story buildings like Casa Grande, which may have served as a residence for leaders or as an observatory for priests who watched the heavens and kept track of the calendar. Mesoamerican beliefs and practices may also have influenced the development of the sophisticated Anasazi culture that developed in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon. By the 11th century, there were at least 5,000 people living there in large multi-story dwellings, such as Pueblo Bonito, which contained some 800 rooms laid out around a plaza where people gathered for ceremonies in subterranean chambers called kivas. A network of roads linked Pueblo Bonito and nearby structures to outlying settlements, suggesting that this was the hub of a well-organized society with strong leadership. Buildings and rock paintings were aligned to catch the sun's rays and highlight equinoxes, solstices, and other astronomical events. Among the items the Anasazi living in Pueblo Bonito acquired through trade were macaw feathers and copper bells from Mesoamerica. After 1200, Chaco Canyon declined as a center of Anasazi culture, most likely as a result of prolonged drought. Many Anasazi moved to high plateaus such as Mesa Verde in Colorado, where rain fell more often than in the parched lowlands. Settlers there farmed the Mesa tops and built spectacular cliff dwellings in the alcoves of canyon walls. The remoteness of those cliff dwellings may have discouraged raids by enemies, but they were not designed strictly as fortresses. Circular structures resembling watchtowers were in fact ill-suited for that purpose and were probably used for ceremonial purposes. Most cliff dwellings were inhabited for only a century or so before drought and soil exhaustion depleted the area and forced the occupants to migrate around 1300, leaving behind haunting mountain monuments to the architectural ingenuity of the Anasazi. Coronado, commenting on Pueblo construction, although they are not decorated with turquoises nor made of lime or good bricks, nevertheless they are good houses, 3 and 4 and 5 stories high. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado's expedition of 1540 to the Native American towns he called pueblos was inspired by vague reports of glittering cities whose inhabitants were rich in gold, silver, and turquoise. Coronado and his men discovered those stories were grossly exaggerated, but they were duly impressed by the sturdy adobe dwellings the inhabitants had constructed in the manner after their Anasazi predecessors. Most who survived this prolonged period of drought and disruption settled near permanent water sources, such as the Rio Grande. Congregating in villages, Spaniards dubbed the pueblos or towns. The Pueblo people inhabiting those villages spoke different languages, but shared customs inherited from the Anasazi, including the practice of living close together in multi-story adobe dwellings, gatherings in kivas for social and religious ceremonies, and raising corn and other crops in irrigating fields. Some of the communities they founded in the 14th and 15th centuries, such as the Acoma Pueblo, survive to this day and rank as the oldest continuously occupied settlements north of Mexico. The cultural heritage of both the Anasazi and the Mississippians was still very much in evidence in 1540 when Francisco Vasquez de Coronado began to blaze a fiery trail across the southwest in search of fortune, while Hernando de Soto did the same in the southeast. De Soto encountered tribes who continued to revere the sun and worship at temples atop burial mounds, much as the residents of Cahoyquia did. Coronado entered pueblos whose Anasazi-inspired buildings were so imposing that a distant observer mistook one village for a city. By the time those expeditions ended 3 years later with De Soto's death and Coronado's return to Mexico, the conquistadors had left an indelible mark on North America. Many accomplished tribal societies were already crumbling from the impact of conquest or disease, and few would survive European contact without undergoing wrenching change.